The night everything changed. There is a kind of silence that does not feel peaceful. It is the kind of silence that sits on your chest like a heavy stone, pressing down slowly, making it hard to breathe without noticing the emptiness around you. It is the kind of silence that follows a man from room to room, that lingers in the corners of high ceilings, that echoes when a single footstep lands on a marble floor in a house that is far too large for one person. It is the kind of silence that reminds you, every single night without fail, that you are completely alone in a world you have spent your entire life controlling. Dante Rixai knew that silence better than he knew anything else in the world. He knew it better than he knew the weight of a gun in his hand, better than he knew the tension before a deal went wrong, better than he knew the sound of men who feared him lowering their eyes when he walked into a room. The silence of his mansion had become his most constant companion, the one thing he could not order away, the one thing that did not flinch when he raised his voice or go quiet when he gave a command. It was simply always there, waiting for him at the end of every long day, sitting beside him at a table built for 20 people where only one chair was ever pulled out. The mansion itself was extraordinary in the way that very expensive and very empty things often are. It sat at the end of a long private road, surrounded by iron gates and security cameras and men in dark coats who stood at their posts through rain and cold without ever being asked twice. The building had been designed by one of the most respected architects in the country, and it showed in every detail: the soaring windows that stretched from floor to ceiling and let in the pale morning light, the grand staircase that curved like a sleeping wave toward the upper floors, the library with its thousands of books that nobody ever read, the enormous kitchen that smelled of good food every evening, and yet always felt too polished and too still the moment the staff stepped out for the night. There were 12 bedrooms in that house. Dante slept in one. He had never once stood inside 5 of the others. They existed the same way many things in his life existed, because they were there, because they had been built, because he had the power to have them, but not because they served any real purpose in the quiet machinery of his daily existence. He was 41 years old. He had silver threading through the dark hair at his temples, not from age exactly, but from the particular kind of stress that comes from carrying the weight of an empire built on things that polite people do not discuss at dinner tables. His face was the face of a man who had learned very early that expressions cost you something, that showing how you felt was a kind of weakness that other people would one day use against you. So he had spent 20 years practicing stillness. He had become very good at it. So good, in fact, that he sometimes sat alone in his study late at night and could not remember the last time his face had done something that was not deliberate. The staff of the mansion understood the rules without being told them twice. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elena Caruso, a small and sturdy woman in her late 50s who wore her gray hair pinned back and moved through the house with the quiet confidence of someone who had been doing this long enough to know where every creak in the floor was, had briefed every new employee on the same basic principles. You do your work. You do it well. You do not linger. You do not make unnecessary noise. You do not speak to Mr. Rixai unless he speaks to you first. And above all, above every other rule, spoken or unspoken, you do not bring personal matters into the house. Your life outside these walls stays outside these walls. It was because of this last rule that the situation with Lena Morty had been handled with a great deal of quiet awkwardness when she first arrived 6 weeks ago. Lena was 27, newly divorced, and the kind of person who carried herself with a dignity that felt earned rather than inherited. She had brown eyes that were warm but careful, and hands that were always slightly roughened from work she had been doing since she was a teenager. She had applied for the position of junior housekeeper through an agency, and Mrs. Caruso had hired her because the reference letters were excellent, and because Lena had looked her directly in the eye during the interview without a single trace of the nervous performance that some candidates put on to try to seem more impressive than they were. What the application had not mentioned, because the agency had not thought to ask, was that Lena had a daughter. The daughter's name was Sophia. She was 3 years old and 4 months, and she was the kind of child that certain people who have forgotten what it feels like to see the world as a genuinely interesting place, tend to describe as a lot. She was small for her age, with a round face and dark curly hair that her mother tied into 2 lopsided puffs every morning, and she had her mother's brown eyes but none of her mother's caution. Sophia looked at everything with an open, wondering attention that suggested she had not yet learned that the world could disappoint you. She asked questions constantly. She narrated what she was doing in a running commentary of soft, earnest sentences. She carried a small yellow blanket with her everywhere she went, holding it by one corner so it trailed behind her like a tiny flag. When Lena had accepted the position, she had been honest with the agency about her situation. She had explained that her childcare arrangement, her mother, who had been watching Sophia, had fallen through suddenly, and that she was working on finding a new solution, but that in the very short term there were going to be 2 or 3 evenings a week when Sophia would need to come with her to work. The agency had passed this information to Mrs. Caruso, with the careful wording of people who did not want to lose a good candidate. Mrs. Caruso, who had raised 3 children of her own and had a heart that was considerably softer than the rules she enforced, had said that she would allow it temporarily, strictly on the condition that the child stayed in the staff quarters on the lower level of the East Wing, that she did not wander, and that she was never, under any circumstances, to go near the main areas of the house, and absolutely never near Mr. Ricksey's private rooms. Lena had agreed immediately and without hesitation. She understood what the rules were. She was not the kind of person who tested boundaries or pushed for exceptions. She was grateful for the job, she needed the income, and she worked hard enough on the evenings she was there that Mrs. Caruso had quietly decided that the temporary arrangement was going to stretch a little longer than originally planned. Lena was good at her work. She was thorough and efficient, and she never had to be told something more than once. The only unpredictable element in this entire arrangement was Sophia. Sophia was 3 years old and 4 months, and she did not fully understand walls or rules or the concept of spaces that were not meant for her. She understood her yellow blanket. She understood her mother's voice. She understood that certain faces were kind faces and certain faces were serious faces. She understood that when it was raining very hard outside, and the thunder made a sound like something very large and very angry rolling across the sky, the feeling in her chest was sharp and cold, and she did not want to be alone with it. The storm that arrived on the 4th Thursday of October was not a gentle one. It had been building all afternoon in the gray weight of the clouds, and by the time the evening came, it had become the kind of storm that makes the whole world feel temporary and fragile. The rain hit the tall windows of the mansion in heavy, irregular sheets. The wind moved through the trees outside with a sound like voices that couldn't quite find their words. Lightning came in bright, silent flashes that lit the rooms for half a second before the darkness came back harder than before. And then the thunder followed, deep, rolling, enormous, filling the spaces between the walls and the ceilings, and making the air itself feel thick with something threatening. In the staff quarters on the lower level of the East Wing, Lena was finishing the last of the evening's tasks. She had been cleaning the silver service that Mrs. Caruso needed polished before the weekend, a careful and time-consuming job that required her full attention. Sophia had been settled on the small cot with her yellow blanket and a picture book that she could not yet read but liked to look at because the pictures had animals on every page. Lena had turned on the small lamp on the table beside her, and the last time she checked, Sophia had been quiet, the book open on her lap, her thumb moving slowly across the picture of a sleeping elephant. That was 40 minutes ago. What Lena did not know, because she was in the room at the far end of the hall with the door pulled nearly closed to keep the sound of her work from disturbing anyone, was that the thunder had done something to Sophia that the picture book and the yellow blanket had not been able to fix. It had reached inside the small, certain world of a 3-year-old and replaced it with a cold, dark, uncertain thing that felt very large. Sophia had sat with that feeling for a while, the way very small children sometimes do, holding the blanket tighter, pulling her knees up, waiting for it to go away on its own. But it had not gone away. The thunder had come again and the lamp had flickered, and that was enough. Sophia had climbed off the cot, taken her yellow blanket by the corner, and gone to find her mother. She had gone in the wrong direction. The staff quarters were connected to the main house by a long corridor that was kept dimly lit at night, and it was through this corridor that Sophia had walked, her small bare feet making no sound on the floor, her yellow blanket trailing behind her, her eyes wide and serious in the half-light. She had passed the kitchen, which she recognized, and then gone further than she had ever gone before, through a door that was heavier than the others, and into a part of the house that was made of different materials. Darker wood on the walls, thicker carpet under her feet, and a quiet so complete that her own breathing sounded loud to her. She went up the staircase. She didn't know why, it simply seemed like the direction to go. At the top of the staircase was a long hallway. and at the end of the long hallway was a door with a thin line of warm light coming from underneath it. Sophia walked toward the light. She stood in front of the door for a moment, her yellow blanket clutched against her chest, and she raised her small fist and knocked 3 times with the kind of knocking that a 3-year-old does, not loud, not confident, but real, determined. Inside the room, Dante Rixai put down the document he had been reading. He had been awake since 5 in the morning. He had spent the day in meetings that required the kind of concentration that left you feeling scraped out by evening. He had eaten dinner alone at his desk, as he did most evenings, and he had been working his way through a stack of papers that needed his attention before the morning. The storm outside had been registered somewhere in the back of his mind as an inconvenience. It made the satellite connection unreliable and the men on the perimeter miserable, but otherwise he had not thought much about it. When the knock came at his door, his first thought was that it was one of his security team. Then he registered the sound of it, small, light, soft, and something in his chest did a thing he did not have words for. He set the paper down. He stood up. He crossed to the door and opened it. And there was Sophia. She was standing in the hallway in a small white nightgown with a pattern of yellow stars on it. Her curly hair was loose around her face. She was holding her yellow blanket against her chest with both arms, and she was looking up at him with an expression that was not afraid. Or rather, that was afraid of the thunder, not of him, because she had not yet learned that Dante Rixai was someone to be afraid of. And in that moment of looking at her, he was quietly, unexpectedly grateful for her ignorance. She looked up at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was soft and very serious, the way children's voices are when they are saying something they have thought carefully about. "Can I sleep here tonight? The thunder is very loud, and I don't want to be alone." Dante Rixai, who had negotiated with men who carried weapons. Dante Rixai, who had sat in rooms where the threat of violence was as present as the air itself, and had never once shown anything on his face that he did not choose to show. Dante Rixai, who had built an empire through a combination of intelligence and will and a particular kind of cold patience that most people spent their lives never developing. Dante Rixai stood at the door of his bedroom and looked at this 3-year-old girl with her yellow blanket and her serious eyes, and he did not know what to do. It was if he was being honest with himself, and in the privacy of his own mind he sometimes still was one of the strangest feelings he had experienced in years. Not because the situation was complicated. It wasn't complicated. It was entirely simple. But it was the simplicity of it that undid something in him slightly, because nothing in his life was simple, and here was this small person asking for the simplest thing imaginable, not to be alone in the storm, and asking it with such directness and such complete absence of any expectation that he might say no, that he could not find the part of himself that would have said no, even though no was the logical answer, even though no was what every rule and routine of the house demanded. He looked at her for what felt to him like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Then he said, in a voice that came out quieter than he intended, "Yes." Sophia nodded, as though this was the answer she had expected, and stepped forward into the room. Dante stood back to let her in. He closed the door quietly. He turned to look at her and found her already standing in the middle of the room, looking around with the calm, assessing attention of a child who is taking in a new environment without judgment. Her eyes moved from the large desk to the tall bookshelves to the window where the rain was still hitting in long, hard lines, and then to the wide, dark bed at the center of the room, which was large enough to look somewhat absurd in relation to the small figure standing in front of it. "It's very big," she said about the bed. "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him. She appeared to be considering something. Then she walked to the side of the bed, the left side, which was the side further from the window, and she put her hands flat on the mattress and tried to climb up. She couldn't quite reach. She tried again. She looked at the mattress with an expression of serious frustration. Dante walked to her side without quite deciding to. He put his hands carefully around her small waist and lifted her up onto the bed. She weighed almost nothing. She arranged herself against the pillows with the practiced efficiency of a child who takes sleep seriously, and pulled her yellow blanket up to her chin and looked at him. "You should sleep too," she said. "The thunder is loud for you also." He looked at her. He looked at this 3-year-old who had walked through his house in the middle of a storm and knocked on his door and climbed into his bed, and was now advising him on his sleeping habits. And something happened in the vicinity of his chest that he recognized. Distantly, and with a kind of incredulous surprise, as the very early beginning of a feeling he had not felt in a very long time. Something that felt almost impossibly like warmth. He did not sleep on the bed. He sat in the chair beside his desk, close enough to the door that he could hear if Lena came looking, and he watched Sophia close her eyes and burrow further into the blanket. Within 4 minutes, she was asleep. He could tell by the change in her breathing, the way it slowed and deepened and became entirely peaceful, as though the thunder had simply ceased to matter now that she was not facing it alone. Dante Rixai sat in his chair in the quiet of his room with the storm still raging outside, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, the silence inside the house did not feel like something pressing down on him. It felt instead like something that was simply resting. He sat there for a long time, watching the slow, even rise and fall of the small yellow blanket, and he did not reach for his papers or his phone or any of the 100 things that usually filled the long hours of his evenings. He just sat there and he breathed, and something inside him, something old and half-forgotten and very careful, began, almost without his permission, to stir. When Lena found the room empty 30 minutes later and felt the first cold wave of panic move through her, and when she ran through the corridor and up the stairs and found the door to Dante Rixai's private bedroom slightly ajar, and when she pushed it open with her heart pounding so loud she could hear it. She stopped. She saw Sophia sleeping, and she saw Dante Rix sitting in the chair beside his desk, his papers forgotten, his face turned toward her daughter with an expression she had never seen on a man's face in that house before. An expression that was quiet and open and entirely without armor. He looked at Lena when she appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then he said very quietly so as not to wake the child, "She knocked on the door herself. She asked to sleep here. I said yes. I should have sent someone to find you. I am sorry for the alarm." Lena stood in the doorway. Her hands were shaking slightly from the panic she had not yet fully come down from. She looked at her daughter sleeping in the enormous bed with her yellow blanket pulled up, looking impossibly small and impossibly peaceful, and then she looked at the man sitting in the chair beside the desk. "I'll take her back," she said. "I'm so sorry. She wasn't supposed to. She knows she isn't supposed to be in this part of the house." "She can stay," Dante said, and then, as though the words surprised even him, "She should sleep. She is already sleeping. Don't wake her." Lena looked at him. She had been in this house for 6 weeks. She had seen this man walk through the rooms he inhabited with the contained, deliberate movement of someone who had built a wall so precisely around themselves that you could not see where the wall ended and the person began. She had watched him sit at the head of his enormous dining table eating alone without once looking up at the room around him. She had learned, the way all the staff had learned, not to look too directly at him, not to speak unless spoken to, not to exist too loudly in his presence. And now he was sitting in his chair at 11 at night with a storm outside and her 3-year-old daughter asleep in his bed, and he was telling her not to wake the child. And his face, for just this one unguarded moment, looked like the face of someone who was not entirely sure what had just happened to him, but who was not, in some quiet and unexpected way, unhappy about it. "Okay," Lena said softly, "thank you." She sat down on the small chair near the door, because she was not going to leave her daughter in a stranger's room, no matter how the man's face looked, no matter how different tonight seemed from every other night in this house. And Dante did not tell her to leave. The three of them stayed in the room together, the powerful man in his chair, the careful woman near the door, and the small child sleeping between them with her yellow blanket, while the storm moved slowly across the sky, and the thunder grew quieter, and the rain against the windows softened from a hammering to a whisper. And that was the night that something changed in the mansion on the private road behind the iron gates. Something that none of them had names for yet. Something that had been brought into the room by a 3-year-old girl with a yellow blanket and 3 simple words that had found, somehow, the one crack in a wall that 20 years of careful living had not been able to fully seal. "Can I sleep here?" And the answer had been yes. As the days pass, Sophia keeps finding her way back to Dante's part of the house, not because she is lost, but because something about him makes her feel safe in a way she cannot explain. Lena begins to see a man that the rest of the world has never been allowed to see. And Dante begins to understand that the thing he has been missing all along was not power, or control, or the quiet that comes after a threat is resolved, but someone, small and stubborn and entirely unafraid, who sees him not as a man to be feared, but simply as a person who looks like he could use some company. But when a threat from Dante's past arrives at the gate, everything that has quietly and carefully grown inside these walls will be put in danger. And the choice Dante makes in the moment that follows will be the most important choice of his life. It had been 11 days since the storm. 11 days since a 3-year-old girl with a yellow blanket had knocked on the wrong door at the wrong hour, and said the right thing to a man who had not known, until that moment, that there was a right thing left in the world that could reach him. 11 days during which the mansion had continued to function exactly as it always had. The gates were guarded. The meetings were held. The papers were signed. The staff moved through their routines with the quiet professionalism that was expected of them. And yet something inside the walls of the house had shifted in a way that was difficult to name precisely, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Dante noticed it first in the mornings. He had always woken early, before the house had fully come alive, before the sounds of the kitchen and the movement of the security shift change had begun. He would sit in the chair by his window with his coffee and read through the night's communications, and the silence of those early hours had always felt productive to him, clean and purposeful, a kind of quiet that belonged to a man who was getting things done. But lately, in those early morning hours, he found himself not reading, not thinking about the day's agenda or the week's arrangements. He found himself listening, not for anything specific, just listening. And if he was being precise about it, which he preferred to be in most areas of his life, what he was listening for was the particular soft sound of small feet on carpet somewhere in the East Wing, and the faint, running commentary of a child narrating her morning to herself. Sophia had been back, not every day, and not because she was wandering or lost. She was 3 years old, not an infant, and she had decided in the clear, uncomplicated way that very small children decide things, that the part of the house with the big quiet rooms and the tall bookshelves and the serious man who had let her sleep was a part of the house that she liked, and she saw no good reason to stay away from it. Lena had tried. She had explained to Sophia, carefully and calmly, in the way you explain things to a 3-year-old when you want them to understand that a rule is real and not optional, that the upper floors of the main house were not a place for them, that Mr. Rixai was a busy man, that they were guests in this house in a way, and guests respected the spaces they were given and did not wander into the spaces they were not. Sophia had listened to all of this with the focused, attentive expression she sometimes used when she was deciding how she felt about something. And then she had nodded and said, "Okay, Mama," and Lena had thought that was that. It was not that. The next afternoon, when Lena was folding linen in the East Wing corridor, she heard Mrs. Caruso's voice from the direction of the kitchen, and the voice had a note in it that made Lena's hands stop moving. It was not an alarmed voice. It was a carefully controlled voice, the kind that is keeping itself from being several other things. Lena had set down the sheet and walked quickly toward the kitchen, and found Mrs. Caruso standing in the hallway just outside it, looking in the direction of the main house with an expression that was professional and concerned in equal measure. "Your daughter," Mrs. Caruso said quietly, "has just walked into Mr. Rixai's study and asked him what he is writing." Lena had closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she had walked to the study. The door was open. Dante was at his desk, his jacket off, his sleeves pushed back, a pen in his hand and a look on his face that was not the face he wore in meetings or when he was moving through the house. It was a different look, not warm exactly, not yet, but something that was no longer entirely the careful blankness she was used to seeing. Sophia was standing on the other side of the desk, her arms folded on the edge of it, her chin resting on her arms, looking up at him with the patient, interested attention of someone who is waiting for an answer and is fully confident that an answer will come. "It's business," Dante said, in the deliberate tone of a man who is not sure of his audience. "What is business?" Sophia said. "It is," he paused, "it is important writing." "My mama does important writing also," Sophia said. "She writes lists. Do you write lists?" There was a silence. "Sometimes," Dante said. "I write lists too," Sophia told him. "But I draw the letters. They are not very good yet. I'm practicing." Lena appeared in the doorway. "Sophia!" Her voice was quiet, controlled, mortified. "Come here right now, please." Sophia looked at her mother. Then she looked at Dante. She seemed to be performing a calculation. Mr. Rixai, she said, very seriously, is it okay if I come back later? Dante looked at the child. He looked at Lena in the doorway. He looked at the pen in his hand. Then he said, yes. Lena stared at him. He met her eyes steadily, the way he met everyone's eyes, but there was something beneath it that was not the usual stillness. There was something that looked impossibly like a man who had surprised himself. She can come back, he said. It is not a problem. From that day forward, something new and entirely unofficial became part of the structure of the mansion. In the afternoons, when Lena was working and Sophia had finished her lunch and her picture books, Sophia went to find Dante. She did not knock every time. After the first few visits, she seemed to understand that the door being open meant she could come in, and the door being closed meant she should wait, which she did, sitting down cross-legged in the hallway outside with her yellow blanket and her particular patience, which was oddly considerable for someone her age, and simply waiting until the door opened and Dante appeared and looked down at her with that expression she had decided she liked, the one that looked like someone remembering something they had forgotten. The staff talked, quietly, carefully, the way staff in houses like this always talk in low voices in the kitchen, with eyes that checked the door before the words were said. Mrs. Caruso had told them all to mind their own business and do their work, and they had done that, but the talking had not entirely stopped, because this was not a normal thing, and the house was not a house where unusual things went unnoticed. What they talked about most was the afternoon near the end of the second week, when one of the groundsmen had been replacing a light fitting in the upper hallway and had heard, coming from the direction of the library, a sound that he had initially been unable to identify. He had stood still in the hallway and listened more carefully, and then he had recognized it. Dante Rixai was reading aloud. He was sitting in the large armchair near the window of the library with Sophia in his lap, and he was reading to her from a picture book she had apparently retrieved from her bag and presented to him with the expectation that he would know what to do with it. His voice was low, unhurried, and entirely patient, and it read the words on the page with the same deliberate precision he applied to everything. Sophia was curled against him with her blanket and her eyes 3/4 closed, listening. The groundsman had not told Mrs. Caruso about this. He had told his colleague in the garden instead, and his colleague had told the kitchen assistant. And from there the information had spread through the staff with the particular speed that surprising information always travels. Nobody said anything in the direction of Lena, who they felt had enough to think about. Nobody said anything near Dante, who they would not have said anything near regardless. Lena found out the same way she found out most things about Sophia, from Sophia herself, who told her at bedtime, as a matter of simple record. Mr. Rixai read me the elephant book, Sophia said from under her blanket. He reads very slowly, but I didn't mind. Lena sat on the edge of the small cot and looked at her daughter and felt something she couldn't quite shape into a thought moving through her. Does he? She said. Yes, Sophia said, and then he sat very still for a while after I fell asleep. I saw him when I woke up. He was just sitting. I think he was thinking. What do you think he was thinking about? Lena asked, because she was curious, and because Sophia sometimes said things that landed more precisely than they had any right to. Sophia considered this with great seriousness for a moment. Then she said, I think he was thinking that it's nice not to be by yourself. Lena looked at her daughter for a long time. Go to sleep, she said softly and turned off the lamp. But she did not sleep herself for a long time after that. She lay in her narrow bed in the staff room and listened to the quietness of the house around her. And she thought about the man who lived in this enormous, impeccable, beautiful, empty mansion. And she thought about the expression she had seen on his face in the study when Sophia had looked up at him and asked if she could come back. And she thought about what it must be like to be a person who had been surrounded by people who feared you for so long that you had begun to forget what it felt like to simply be in the same room as someone who was not afraid. And then she thought about her own life and her own particular variety of loneliness, the kind that comes not from being alone but from having been in the wrong company for too long, and she let herself feel it for just a moment before she folded it back up and put it away, because she was not a woman who spent much time sitting with feelings that didn't move her forward. She was practical, she had to be. That was how she had survived the last 2 years. But something in the practical architecture of her thinking had developed a small, persistent question that she could not quite dismantle, and the question was this. Who was Dante Rixai without the silence around him? She began to find out in pieces. Small pieces, the way you learn most true things about people. Not through grand declarations, but through the accumulation of small moments that, taken together, start to make a shape you recognize. She learned that he drank his coffee without sugar and stood at the kitchen window while he did it, looking out at the garden with an expression of complete private stillness that was different from the controlled stillness he wore in front of other people. She learned that he remembered every single thing that anyone said to him, even things said in passing, in the way that people who are mostly quiet tend to, because when you don't spend much of your energy talking, you have more of it for listening. She learned that he had a very particular and somewhat dry sense of something that might, in other circumstances, have been allowed to become humor, and that it showed itself only in the smallest possible ways. A fractional shift at the corner of his mouth, a pause before a sentence that contained the shape of an observation he had clearly decided not to make fully aloud. She learned these things the way an observer learns things, from a distance in the margins. But it was Sophia who learned them from the inside. Sophia, who had decided that Dante was her person in the house in the same clear, permanent way that children decide things when they have not yet developed the capacity for doubt. Who greeted him every afternoon with the same simple directness of someone who has no idea that warmth is supposed to be earned before it is given. Who told him about her dreams, her observations about the garden, her strong opinions about the relative merits of different animals, her running assessment of which clouds outside the window looked most like the things she thought they looked like. Who fell asleep in his library and in the chair beside his desk, and once on the wide windowsill in the east-facing sitting room with a beam of afternoon light across her curly hair and her yellow blanket tucked under her chin. While Dante sat 3 feet away reading a document he had read 6 times without absorbing because he kept looking up. And Dante, who had not let anyone close to him in a long time, who had learned to treat proximity as a liability, who had built the silence around him as carefully and deliberately as a wall, Dante let her in. Not because he decided to. Not because he reasoned through the risk and concluded the mathematics were favorable. But because she arrived every afternoon and simply sat with him, and she did not want anything from him except his company, and she did not see him as powerful or frightening or complicated, and he did not know how to explain to her that she should. And after a while he found that he had stopped trying, and that the room they were in together felt different from every other room he occupied, and that different was something he had not felt in a very long time, and that he had, without quite realizing when it had started, begun to look forward to the afternoons in a way he had not looked forward to anything in years. It was on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 11 days after the storm, that Lena came to the library to collect Sophia and found her already awake, sitting on the floor in front of Dante's chair building a small construction out of books she had pulled from the lower shelves, not opened, just stacked, in the way children use books as physical objects before they understand what they are for. Dante was watching her from his chair. Lena stood in the doorway for a moment without either of them noticing her. And in that moment she saw Dante's face completely unguarded for the first and only time, open and still, and quietly full of something so deep and so careful that it looked almost like grief, except it was moving in the other direction. And then he looked up and saw Lena, and the guard came back, not fully, not the way it used to be, but partially the way a door closes that can no longer quite shut all the way because the frame has shifted. She was fine, he said. She has been building something. I can see that, Lena said. And then, because she was not the kind of person who pretended she hadn't seen what she had seen, she said quietly, "Thank you for all of it, for the last 11 days, for being patient with her." Dante was quiet for a moment. "She is easy to be patient with," he said finally. And he said it simply, the way he said everything without adornment, but it was the truest thing Lena had heard him say, and they both knew it. She was gathering Sophia's things when the sound came from outside. Not the weather this time, not a storm. It was the particular flat sound of the security system at the main gate sending its alert through the house. A sound the staff had been told to treat as a signal to go to their rooms and stay there until given the clear. A sound that Dante recognized instantly because it was a sound that had its own particular history in the story of his life, the kind of sound that meant something from outside the walls had arrived, and it had not been invited. Dante was on his feet before the echo of the alert had fully died. The ease of the afternoon fell from him completely, like a coat he had simply removed. He was suddenly, entirely, the other version of himself, focused, contained, precise, moving toward the door with a speed and purpose that made the room feel different around him. He stopped in the doorway. He turned back. He looked at Lena, who had pulled Sophia up off the floor and was holding her against her side, one arm around her. Her face calm in the way that Lena's face was always calm when she was actually frightened, because she had learned a long time ago that her daughter read her expressions before she read the room. Dante looked at them both, and something that had been moving slowly toward the surface in him over 11 careful days reached it all at once, suddenly and without warning, in the way that things that have been building for a long time sometimes arrive, not gradually, but in a single, clarifying instant. "Go to the room at the end of the east wing," he said. "The one with the lock on the inside. Go now, lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except me or Mrs. Caruso. Do you understand?" Lena nodded once. "Go," he said. She went. She carried Sophia down the corridor quickly and quietly, and Sophia, who could feel the change in the air the way children feel things, pressed her face against her mother's shoulder and held her yellow blanket tight and did not ask a single question. Dante watched them go. He stood in the hallway for a moment after they disappeared around the corner, and in that moment, something settled in him that had not been settled in a very long time, a certainty about what mattered, clear and simple, and so obvious he could not understand how he had spent so many years in this house without finding it. He had spent 20 years building walls. In 11 days, a 3-year-old with a yellow blanket had quietly made every single one of them feel beside the point. He turned and walked toward the main gate. Whatever was waiting for him there, he would face it. He always did. That part of his life had not changed, and he was not naive enough to believe it would simply stop because something inside him had. But when it was over, he was coming back. And for the first time in 20 years, the thing that was pulling him back was not the silence. It was the opposite of silence entirely. It was a small girl with 2 lopsided hair puffs and a yellow blanket, who had knocked on the wrong door in a storm and asked the simplest question in the world, and who had been, without knowing it, the bravest thing he had ever seen. Thank you for watching. If this story reached something in you, something quiet and real, then you already know why Sophia knocked on that door. Some people walk into your life without a single reason to let them in, and they change everything. Do not forget to return for the next part.